The year was 1860, in Victorian England. Lord Petton's ballroom was bathed in a golden radiance from the chandeliers, illuminating a vast expanse of silken gowns and precisely tailored evening coats. In a secluded corner, partially hidden by a column of marble, stood Miss Isadora Harrington. The weight of her 40 years felt heavy as she watched the couples gliding across the dance floor. "Have you observed?" Lady Caroline Whitmore whispered to her companion from behind her fan. "Miss Harrington has graced yet another season. One might presume, after 2 decades of futility, she would embrace her destiny with a measure of grace." Though spoken softly, the remarks pierced Isadora's ears, striking her like arrows. She straightened her posture, smoothing the deep blue silk of her dress, a color deemed fitting for a lady of her standing and age, and feigned ignorance of the conversation. At the age of 40, Isadora had long grown accustomed to such commentary. As the spinster of the respected Harrington family, she had witnessed her younger sisters marry, her peers establish homes and find husbands in the society that once welcomed her as a debutante, now regarded her with a blend of pity and subtle derision. "Miss Harrington," a voice spoke at her elbow. It was her brother, Edward, the Earl of Westbridge. "You appear somewhat depleted. May I procure you some refreshment?" "Thank you, Edward, but I am perfectly fine," she replied, offering a practiced smile. "I was merely taking note of the new debutantes. Lady Peaton has truly surpassed herself this season." Edward's face softened with genuine concern. "Isadora, you are not obligated to attend every social event. No one would think any less of you if I were to withdraw from society entirely," she concluded for him, a rare spark of defiance crossing her usually placid features, "and become the solitary aunt, only appearing for family christenings and funerals. No, brother, I may not have secured a spouse, but I refuse to completely disappear." Before Edward could offer a reply, a sudden silence fell over the room. Even the orchestra momentarily stumbled. "The Duke of Blackhurst," announced the butler at the main entrance. Richard Vallemont, the 6th Duke of Blackhurst, stood framed in the doorway, a figure both tall and commanding in his flawless evening attire. His dark hair was brushed back from a face that poets often liken to classical marble. At 38, he remained the most coveted bachelor in all of England. His lineage was ancient, his wealth enormous, and his estates counted among the most affluent in the realm. "He looks particularly detached this evening," Edward muttered. "I wonder which unfortunate debutante will be placed in his way tonight." Isadora watched as the assembled guests parted for the Duke as the Red Sea did for Moses. Despite his legendary fortune and standing, Richard Vallemont was known for his coldness, his precise mannerisms, and his apparent immunity to the charms of even the most exquisite young ladies of the ton. "He has rejected 3 flawless matches this season alone," Edward continued. "Lady Peaton must be frantic. Her daughter is one of this year's hopefuls." "Perhaps he finds the procession of innocence tiresome," Isadora responded, slightly taken aback by her own blunt assessment. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Speaking from personal experience, sister." "Speaking as one who has observed 20 seasons from the periphery," she gently corrected. "There is a certain predictability to it all." As the evening progressed, Isadora maintained her pose of dignified observation. She exchanged pleasantries with acquaintances, danced 1 quadrille with her brother-in-law, and otherwise remained discreet, a proficiency she had mastered over the years. An unexpected collision. It was during the supper dance that fate intervened. Seeking a brief reprieve from the crowd in the refreshment room, Isadora unexpectedly collided with a firm figure who was rounding the corner from the opposite side. "My apologies," she began, flustered, before freezing as she found herself gazing directly into the piercing grey eyes of the Duke of Blackhurst. "The error is entirely mine, madam," he responded, his voice deep and melodic. For a fleeting yet unmistakable moment, his eyes held hers with an intensity that caused her heart to flutter. "Miss Harrington," she provided, offering a curtsy befitting his rank. "Miss Harrington," he repeated, as if committing the name to memory. Then, with a formal bow, he proceeded on his way. It was a brief exchange, the type that would typically be forgotten before the close of the evening. Yet, as Isadora returned to the assembly, she could not shake the odd feeling that the Duke's eyes were following her movements across the floor. The scandalous waltz. Later, as the orchestra began a waltz, Isadora prepared to withdraw further into the shadows. It was then that a familiar, deep voice addressed her shoulder. "Miss Harrington, might I be granted the honor of this dance?" The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as the Duke of Blackhurst offered his hand to the most improbable person imaginable. Isadora felt the crushing weight of 100 astonished gazes directed at her. "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely audible above the music, "I fear you have mistaken me for someone else." "I am not in the habit of making errors, Miss Harrington," he countered, the faintest hint of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The waltz awaits. Will you do me the honor?" 20 years of social training urged her to refuse, to spare them both the unavoidable whispers. Yet something in his unwavering gaze compelled her to place her gloved hand in his. "The honor is mine, Your Grace." As he led her onto the floor, the whispers erupted like an agitated swarm of bees. The Duke of Blackhurst, who had declined dances with the season's most acclaimed beauties, was now leading Miss Isadora Harrington, 40 and unmarried, into a waltz. "You recognize, of course, that you have just utterly scandalized the entire gathering," Isadora murmured as they took their places. "Have I?" he replied, appearing genuinely unconcerned as his hand rested at her waist. "I was under the impression I was simply dancing with the most captivating woman in the room." The music began, and Isadora found herself swept into the dance with an elegance she had not known in years. The Duke led with self-assured precision, their steps flawlessly matched, creating the illusion that they had danced together innumerable times before. "You dance beautifully, Miss Harrington," he observed. "Practice, Your Grace," she replied, "though I must admit it has been quite some time since I was last asked to waltz." "Then the gentlemen of the town have shown a remarkable failure of judgment." Isadora could not help but laugh, a soft, authentic sound that drew even more attention from those nearby. "You are either excessively gracious or deliberately provocative, Your Grace. I have yet to determine which." "Perhaps both," he conceded, guiding her through a turn with effortless skill. "Tell me, Miss Harrington, do you find these events enjoyable?" "They serve their purpose," she answered non-committally. "That was not my question." The directness of his stare unnerved her. It had been years since anyone had looked at her with such focused attention, as if her feelings and ideas warranted true consideration. "No," she finally admitted. "I find them rather monotonous, but one must keep up appearances." "Indeed," he murmured, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something in his expression, a fleeting shadow of comprehension that suggested he, too, wore a mask for the benefit of society. As the final strains of the waltz faded, the Duke escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom. Before taking his departure, he leaned in slightly to speak close to her ear. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Harrington. It was, without question, the highlight of an otherwise insufferable evening." Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with that unique blend of authority and detachment that seemed inherently his. Leaving Isadora to face the approaching wave of curious acquaintances, all desperate to discover what the Duke of Blackhurst could possibly have said to the spinster of Harrington House. The morning after, in the carriage ride home that evening, Edward regarded his sister with poorly concealed curiosity. "Well," he finally prompted, "will you not tell me what transpired between you and Blackhurst?" Isadora looked out at the gas-lit streets of London, streaming past the window. "We danced, Edward, nothing more." "The most sought-after man in England does not just dance with anyone, Isadora. Particularly not when he has declined the hand of every debutante this season." She turned to face her brother, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps he was merely being kind. Edward scoffed. Blackhurst is many things. Wealthy, powerful, respected, but kind has never been among his known qualities. The man has a heart of stone if the rumors are to be believed. Isadora returned her gaze to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the darkness outside. Then perhaps, she said softly, the rumors are wrong. Back at Harrington House, as her lady's maid assisted her in preparing for bed, Isadora caught sight of herself in the looking-glass. The face looking back was neither youthful nor beautiful by society's criteria. The fresh bloom of youth had faded, leaving behind a woman with faint lines at the corners of her eyes and a certain seriousness to her demeanor. Yet, for the first time in years, she looked at her reflection and wondered if perhaps there was something still deserving of notice in the woman she had become, something that had captured the attention of the most discerning man in England, if only for the duration of a single waltz. "Nonsense!" she scolded herself aloud, dismissing the thought. A man like the Duke of Blackhurst would never seriously consider women like Isadora Harrington. Whatever his reasons for singling her out tonight, it would surely prove to be nothing more than a momentary whim, forgotten by morning. Little did she realize that across London, in the lavish study of his townhouse, the Duke of Blackhurst sat with a glass of brandy, contemplating the unexpected discovery he had made at the Peaton ball. A woman whose quiet dignity and intelligent eyes had, in the span of a single dance, intrigued him more than all the season's bright young things combined. A token of intrigue. The morning following the Peaton ball dawned grey and drizzly, a suitable backdrop to Isadora's thoughts as she sat at her writing desk, drafting a letter to her married sister in Hampshire. She had nearly convinced herself that the previous night's encounter with the Duke had been nothing more than a strange anomaly, until the butler appeared at her door. "A delivery for you, Miss Harrington," he announced, with the slightest hint of surprise in his usually impassive voice. The footman following him carried a magnificent arrangement of deep crimson roses, so numerous they nearly obscured his face. As the footman placed the crystal vase on a side table, Isadora stared in confusion. "There must be some error," she began. "No, miss," the butler replied, presenting a small cream-colored card on a silver tray. The messenger was most precise. With slightly trembling fingers, Isadora took the card. Written upon it, in a bold, masculine hand, were the words, "To brighten a dreary London morning. Blackhurst, heavens above," she whispered, the card nearly slipping from her grasp. The butler cleared his throat discreetly. "Will there be a reply, Miss Harrington?" "I know. Not at present," she managed, still staring at the roses as though they might disappear if she looked away. When the servants had withdrawn, Isadora approached the flowers, inhaling their rich perfume. In all her 40 years, no gentleman had ever sent her flowers, not even during her debut season, when she had been young and moderately attractive, if never a true beauty. "What game is he playing?" she murmured, gently touching one velvety petal. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her sister-in-law, Charlotte, Countess of Westbridge, who burst into the room in a flurry of mourning silk. "Is it true?" Charlotte demanded without preamble. "Did the Duke of Blackhurst truly send you roses?" Isadora sighed. News travels with remarkable swiftness in this household. "The servants talk, especially when something so unprecedented occurs," Charlotte replied, circling the arrangement with wide eyes. "Isadora, these must have cost a small fortune at this time of year." "I am sure it is merely a courtesy after our dance," Isadora said, trying to sound dismissive. Charlotte gave her a knowing look. "The Duke of Blackhurst does not dance with spinsters, nor does he send them roses as a courtesy. Something very peculiar is happening." Edward's concern. Before Isadora could formulate a reply, the butler reappeared. "Lord Westbridge requests Miss Harrington's presence in the study." Downstairs, Edward paced before the fireplace, his expression worried. He paused when Isadora entered. "I've just returned from my club," he began without preamble. The entire town is discussing nothing but you and Blackhurst." Isadora sank into a chair. Surely there are more significant matters worthy of discussion. "Not in London during the season," Edward replied grimly. "Particularly not when the most sought-after bachelor in England singled out her." He stopped abruptly. "A spinster," Isadora finished for him, her voice calm despite the hurt. "You need not moderate your words, Edward. I am fully aware of my position." Her brother had the decency to appear remorseful. "Forgive me. I only meant that it is highly unusual and people are curious. Blackhurst has rejected innumerable suitable young ladies. Why should he suddenly show interest in someone so clearly inappropriate?" "I assure you, I've asked myself the very same question," Isadora concluded for him. Edward crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand. "Isadora, I'm concerned for you. If Blackhurst is playing some kind of cruel jest, then I shall be no worse off than I am now," she replied softly. Her brother studied her face. "You find him captivating, don't you?" Isadora withdrew her hand. "I found our brief conversation refreshingly candid, nothing more. And now he has sent roses, which is certainly flattering, but hardly an indication of serious intention." "Be cautious," Edward warned, rising. "Blackhurst may be the most eligible man in England, but he is not known for his warmth. Some allege he ended his last engagement because Lady Eleanor Brinsley once laughed too loudly at dinner." Isadora raised an eyebrow. "Gossip, Edward. I expected better of you." "Not gossip, but worry," he corrected. "You have established a life of dignity despite society's unkindness. I would hate to see you wounded by a man incapable of appreciating your value." A second encounter. The conversation lingered in Isadora's mind as she prepared for the Harringtons' yearly visit to the Royal Academy exhibition that afternoon. It was a family ritual, one of the few social gatherings where her status as an unmarried woman attracted little notice, as art appreciation was considered an acceptable pursuit for ladies of all stations. She chose a walking dress of deep forest green, a color she favored for its quiet elegance. As her maid dressed her hair, Isadora found herself paying unusual attention to her appearance, pinching color into her cheeks and selecting her most exquisite lace collar. "Nonsense," she murmured again, though with less conviction than before. At the Royal Academy, the Harrington group moved slowly through the packed galleries, pausing to admire portraits and landscapes amidst the crush of fashionable society. Isadora had just moved away from her family to examine a particularly fine seascape when a familiar voice spoke beside her. "Turner, at his most brilliant, would you not agree, Miss Harrington?" She turned to find the Duke of Blackhurst at her elbow, magnificent in a flawlessly tailored morning coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and impressive height. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a small curtsy. "Yes, his command of light is unparalleled." "You have an appreciation for art?" he inquired, his grey eyes studying her with the same disquieting intensity she remembered from the ball. "I do," she replied simply, "though I claim no expertise, merely an enthusiast's enjoyment." "That is refreshing," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we proceed to the next gallery? I find most commentary on art to be tiresomely affected, but I suspect yours might prove an exception." Aware of the curious glances directed their way, Isadora hesitated before placing her gloved hand lightly on his arm. "You risk further scandal, Your Grace. 2 encounters in as many days will set tongues wagging even more vigorously." "Let them talk," he replied dismissively. "I have endured society's speculation for years. It holds no terror for me." As they moved through the exhibition, Isadora found herself relaxing into their conversation. The Duke, it transpired, possessed a genuine knowledge of art, acquired through travel and study rather than mere trend. Even more surprisingly, he was willing to listen to her observations, responding with thoughtful comments that expanded upon her ideas instead of dismissing them. "You have traveled to Florence, then?" he asked, as they paused before an Italian landscape. "No," she admitted. My knowledge comes entirely from books and exhibitions. I have never left England. Something akin to surprise flickered across his features. Never. With your obvious appreciation for culture and art, I would have thought. My circumstances have not allowed extensive travel, she explained simply, without self-pity. The Duke's expression shifted subtly. A great oversight. The Uffizi Gallery alone would offer you a lifetime of contemplation. Before she could reply, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Peaton and her daughter, the attractive but shallow Miss Peaton, whose unsuccessful attempts to gain the Duke's attention at her own ball had been the subject of much whispered gossip. "Your Grace," Lady Peaton exclaimed, her astonishment at finding him in Miss Harrington's company barely concealed. "What an unexpected delight! Penelope and I were just admiring the Reynolds portrait." "Lady Peaton," the Duke acknowledged with a cool but correct bow. "Miss Peaton, I trust you are enjoying the exhibition." "Oh, immensely," gushed Miss Peaton, subtly inching closer to him while pretending Isadora was not there. "Though I must confess, these historical subjects can be so dull. I much prefer more romantic themes." The Duke's expression remained neutral. "Indeed. Miss Harrington and I were just discussing Turner's pioneering approach to light and atmosphere. She has offered several observations that I found quite enlightening." All eyes turned to Isadora, who felt a blush creeping up her cheeks at this unexpected commendation. "How intriguing," Lady Peaton replied, her smile strained. "I had no idea Miss Harrington harbored such scholarly interests." "Few people take the time to discover what lies beneath the surface," the Duke replied, his tone carrying a subtle sharpness that was not lost on either woman. An awkward silence followed, broken only when Edward appeared at Isadora's side, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Isadora, Mother is requesting your presence," he said, nodding formally to the assembled group. "Your Grace, Ladies Peaton." With a graceful curtsy to the Duke and a polite nod to the Peatons, Isadora allowed herself to be led away. She could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze following her departure. "That is twice in 2 days," Edward murmured under his breath. "And now the roses. People are truly beginning to talk, Isadora." "People always talk, Edward," she replied wearily. "Not about you," he countered. "Not like this." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced conversation and curious looks. By the time the Harrington party returned home, Isadora felt emotionally depleted from the constant scrutiny. Retreating to her private sitting room, Isadora found yet another delivery awaiting her, a beautifully bound volume of Turner's collected works. It came with a note in the Duke's now familiar hand, addressed to a fellow admirer of genius. The note concluded with a request. "Perhaps you might permit me to call tomorrow at 2 Blackhurst." Isadora sank into her chair, clutching the book to her chest, her mind a dizzying mix of confusion and a dangerous spark of hope she had believed long extinguished. Across town, Richard Vallemont, Duke of Blackhurst, sat in his elegant study opposite his oldest friend, Lord James Hartwell, who regarded him with open astonishment. "You cannot be serious, Richard," Hartwell exclaimed. "Miss Harrington, the woman must be nearly 40. "She is precisely 40, the Duke corrected calmly, "and possessed of more intelligence and genuine grace than any debutante I have encountered in the past decade." Hartwell shook his head in disbelief. "The ton will think you've lost your mind. There are a dozen suitable young ladies from the finest families who would simper and agree with every word I uttered, regardless of whether they understood it." Richard interrupted. "Who would marry me for my title, my fortune, and the prestige of being a duchess, without the slightest interest in who I am beneath those trappings?" "And Miss Harrington is different," Hartwell challenged skeptically. The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Entirely different. She speaks her mind. She observes the world with clear eyes, and she expects nothing from me, which I find makes me want to offer her everything." Hartwell studied his friend with growing concern. "Richard, if this is some rebellion against society's expectations..." "It is not," the Duke replied firmly. "For the first time in my life, James, I've met a woman whose company I genuinely enjoy, who challenges my thoughts rather than merely reflecting them back to me. Is that so difficult to comprehend? For the Richard Vallemont I have known since Cambridge? Yes, frankly it is," Hartwell replied. "You've always been so controlled, so certain of your path." Richard gazed into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps it is time for a different path." "You realize what you're contemplating?" Hartwell pressed. "The scandal would be unprecedented. A duke, particularly one of your standing, does not marry a spinster with no fortune and no connections beyond a minor." "I said nothing of marriage," Richard replied, though the slight tension in his jaw belied his casual tone. Hartwell laughed without humor. "My friend, you have publicly singled out a respectable unmarried woman of good family. You've sent her flowers and books. You've requested permission to call. Either you are contemplating marriage, or you are behaving in a manner most would consider dishonorable." The Duke's expression hardened. "You know me better than that." "I do," Hartwell conceded, "which is why your sudden interest in Miss Harrington is so baffling. You have refused the hand of every suitable young lady presented to you for years, citing various trivial flaws. Now you appear captivated by a woman who, by society's reckoning, is thoroughly on the shelf." "Society," Richard said coldly, "can go hang." Hartwell sighed, recognizing the implacable resolve that had made his friend one of the most formidable men in England. "Very well. But tread carefully, Richard. Miss Harrington has undoubtedly endured years of subtle cruelty from the ton. If you pursue her only to withdraw, the consequences for her would be devastating." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in the Duke's grey eyes, an expression so rare that Hartwell nearly missed it. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool determination that was the Duke's hallmark. "I have no intention of withdrawing," Richard stated with quiet finality. "Miss Harrington has waited 40 years to be properly seen. I intend to ensure she never feels invisible again." The following afternoon found Isadora seated in the Harrington house drawing room, her hands tightly clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. The mantel clock ticked relentlessly toward 2 o'clock, each second bringing her closer to the Duke's promised call. She'd spent the morning in a state of uncharacteristic indecision, changing her gown 3 times before settling on a deep burgundy daydress that complemented her hair, now showing threads of silver at the temples, and brought a touch of color to her pale complexion. "This is madness," she whispered to herself as the clock chimed the hour. "A man like the Duke of Blackhurst has not seriously caught a woman like me." Yet even as the words left her lips, the butler appeared at the drawing-room door. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackhurst," he announced, his tone suggesting that he too found the situation extraordinary. Richard Vallemont entered the room with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. Dressed impeccably in a charcoal frock coat and dove-grey waistcoat, he seemed to bring a different atmosphere with him, something electric and vital that made the familiar drawing-room suddenly seem more vibrant. "Miss Harrington," he greeted her, bowing over her hand with perfect courtesy. "You are most kind to receive me." "Your Grace," she replied, gesturing to a chair opposite her own. "I confess, your request took me by surprise." "A pleasant one, I hope?" he inquired, taking the offered seat. Isadora hesitated. "A puzzling one," she admitted finally. "You must be aware that your attention has caused quite a stir." A smile, brief but genuine, transformed his austere features. "Good. The ton has grown far too comfortable in its rigid expectations. A little disruption is long overdue." "Is that what I am?" she asked quietly. "A disruption to the established order?" The Duke studied her face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beneath surfaces. "You are many things, Miss Harrington, but a mere instrument of social rebellion is not one of them." The butler returned with tea, providing Isadora with a momentary reprieve from the intensity of the Duke's attention. As she poured for them both, she was acutely aware of the domestic intimacy of the scene, something she had observed countless times between her married sisters and their husbands, but had never experienced herself. "You enjoyed the book?" the Duke inquired, accepting his cup with a nod of thanks. "Very much," she replied, relaxing slightly at the shift to safer conversational ground. "The color plates are magnificent. Thank you for such a thoughtful gift." "It seemed fitting," he said. "Your observations yesterday revealed a genuine appreciation that deserves cultivation." Isadora sipped her tea, gathering courage for the question that had haunted her since the Piton ball. "Your Grace, forgive my directness, but I must ask, why have you singled me out for these attentions?" Richard set down his cup, his expression serious. "Because in a sea of artifice, you stand as a beacon of authenticity. Because when you speak, you say what you mean rather than what you believe I wish to hear. Because your eyes reflect a depth of thought and feeling that I find compelling." The simple honesty of his answer stole Isadora's breath. No man had ever spoken to her with such straightforward admiration, not even in her youth, when she had still harbored hopes of marriage. "I am 40 years old, Your Grace," she reminded him, her voice steady, despite the tumult of emotions his words had stirred. "I have no fortune, no particular beauty, and no accomplishments beyond those expected of any gentlewoman. Surely there are dozens of young ladies more worthy of your interest." "Worthy," he repeated, an edge entering his voice. A curious choice of words. "Tell me, Miss Harrington, by what measure do you determine a person's worth? By youth, beauty, fortune? These seem remarkably shallow criteria for a woman of your intelligence." Isadora flushed. "You misunderstand me. I meant only that society—" "Society," he interrupted, "has consistently demonstrated a profound inability to recognize true value. I, however, am not so limited in my perceptions." A charged silence fell between them, broken only when the Duke rose and crossed to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Perhaps I should speak plainly," he said, turning back to face her. "I've spent the past 15 years avoiding matrimony, Miss Harrington, because I have never encountered a woman whose company I could envision tolerating for a lifetime. Until now." Isadora stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, if this is some kind of jest—" "I do not jest about matters of such importance," he replied, his expression grave. "I am well aware that my attention has placed you in an uncomfortable position. Society whispers, your family worries, and you yourself must be uncertain of my intentions." He returned to his seat, leaning forward slightly. "Allow me to clarify them. I wish to court you, Miss Harrington, with the utmost propriety and respect. If, after a period of better acquaintance, you find my company as agreeable as I find yours, I hope you might consider a more permanent arrangement." Isadora felt as though the floor had fallen away beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," he replied simply. "The scandal means nothing to me. The disparity in our situations is relevant only if we allow it to be. Your family's expectations are not my concern. I am the head of my house and answer to no one regarding my choice of bride." His calm dismantling of each objection left Isadora speechless. Finally, she managed to ask the question that lay at the heart of her disbelief. "Why me, Your Grace? After all these years of refusing every eligible match, why would you choose someone society considers thoroughly unmarriageable?" Richard's expression softened. "Because when we danced, Miss Harrington, I felt for the first time that I was in the presence of a woman who saw me, not the Duke, not the fortune, not the ancient title, but the man beneath all those trappings. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Before she could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit Lady Harrington, Isadora's mother, whose surprise at finding the Duke of Blackhurst in her drawing-room was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of social grace. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, curtsying deeply. "What an unexpected honor! I do apologize for interrupting." "Not at all, Lady Harrington," Richard replied, rising to bow. "I was just discussing the Royal Academy exhibition with your daughter. Her insights are most illuminating." Lady Harrington's gaze darted between them, clearly struggling to make sense of the scene before her. "How delightful. Isadora has always been fond of art, though I fear her observations may lack the sophistication to truly interest someone of your background, Your Grace." Isadora felt a familiar pang at her mother's dismissive tone, a subtle diminishment she had endured for years as her marriage prospects faded. "On the contrary," the Duke replied, his voice cooling perceptibly. "Miss Harrington's understanding rivals that of many so-called experts of my acquaintance. You must be very proud of her accomplishments." Lady Harrington blinked, clearly unaccustomed to hearing her eldest daughter praised by anyone, let alone one of the most powerful men in England. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "Isadora has always been studious." The Duke turned back to Isadora, ignoring the obvious discomfort his presence had created. "Miss Harrington, might I prevail upon you to accompany me to the conservatory at Kew Gardens tomorrow? The tropical specimens are particularly fine this season." Aware of her mother's widening eyes, Isadora hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I should like that very much, Your Grace." "Excellent. Shall we say 11 o'clock? I will send my carriage." With that, he bowed to both ladies and took his leave, his departure leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in its wake. "Isadora," Lady Harrington breathed when the front door had closed behind him. "What in heaven's name is happening? First the roses, now a private call and an invitation to Kew. The Duke of Blackhurst is courting you." "It would appear so, Mother," Isadora replied, still trying to absorb the reality of the situation herself. Lady Harrington sank into a chair, fanning herself vigorously. But why? After all these years of being overlooked, to suddenly attract the attention of the most eligible bachelor in England. It defies all understanding. Isadora winced at her mother's artless candor. "Thank you for that assessment, Mother." Lady Harrington had the grace to look abashed. "Forgive me, my dear. I did not mean... That is to say, you have always been accomplished and well-bred, of course, but at your age—" "Yes, Mother, I am quite aware of my age," Isadora interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, "as I believe is the Duke." "But what can he possibly want?" Lady Harrington persisted, bewilderment evident in every line of her face. Isadora rose, suddenly weary of the conversation. "Perhaps, Mother, he wants what any man seeks in a potential wife: companionship, understanding, and mutual respect." "At your age," Lady Harrington repeated, seemingly unable to move past this central fact. "It's unprecedented." "Many things about the Duke appear to be unprecedented," Isadora replied softly. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I shall rest before dinner. Tomorrow promises to be eventful." As she climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, Isadora's mind whirled with conflicting emotions, disbelief warring with a dangerous, fragile hope that she had thought long dead. Could the Duke truly be serious in his intentions? Or was this, as her mother feared, some incomprehensible game whose rules she did not understand? In the privacy of her room, Isadora sat at her dressing table, studying her reflection with new eyes. The face that looked back at her was handsome rather than beautiful, strong features softened by intelligent eyes and a generous mouth. Time had etched fine lines at the corners of those eyes and across her brow, but had also bestowed a certain dignity, a gravity that her younger self had lacked. Could he truly see something worthwhile in this face? She whispered to her reflection. Sleep proved elusive that night. Isadora lay awake, replaying the Duke's words in her mind, searching for hidden meanings or subtle mockery, and finding none. His manner had been direct, his gaze sincere, his intentions stated with a clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. Yet still she doubted. 20 years of watching from the sidelines as other women were chosen, courted, and wed had left deep scars on her heart. The idea that she overlooked unmarriageable Isadora Harrington might have captured the attention of the most sought-after bachelor in England seemed more fantasy than reality. Morning brought no respite from her confusion. As her maid helped her dress for the promised excursion to Kew Gardens, selecting a walking gown of deep teal that complemented her coloring, Isadora found herself trembling with a combination of anticipation and dread. "You look lovely, miss," her maid assured her, arranging a modest hat atop Isadora's carefully styled hair. "Thank you, Bennet," Isadora replied, managing a small smile, "though I fear lovely may be an overstatement at my age." "Nonsense," the maid replied loyally. "There's more to beauty than youth, and if I may be so bold, miss, the Duke seems to have recognized that fact." Precisely at 11, the Blackhurst carriage arrived. A magnificent conveyance of gleaming black lacquer emblazoned with the ducal crest. The footman who handed Isadora into its luxurious interior treated her with the deference usually reserved for women of much higher rank, adding to the surreal quality of the morning. The Duke was waiting at the entrance to the gardens, his tall figure commanding attention despite the simplicity of his attire. As Isadora descended from the carriage, she observed a flicker of admiration in his eyes that sent an unfamiliar warmth coursing through her veins. "Miss Harrington," he greeted her, bowing over her hand. "You are punctual, another quality I find admirable." "Your Grace," she replied, dropping a curtsy. "Thank you for the invitation. It has been some years since I last visited Kew." "Then we shall remedy that oversight immediately," he declared, offering his arm. "The Palm House awaits, and I believe you will find the orchid collection particularly impressive." As they strolled through the magnificent glass structures housing exotic plants from across the empire, Isadora gradually felt her tension easing. The Duke proved a knowledgeable guide, sharing insights gained from his own travels and listening with genuine interest to her observations. They paused beneath the soaring glass dome of the Palm House, surrounded by towering tropical specimens that created the illusion of a far-distant land. "It's rather like stepping into another world," Isadora remarked, tilting her head back to admire the architectural marvel above them. "Indeed," the Duke agreed, though his gaze remained fixed on her upturned face rather than the surroundings. "Miss Harrington, may I speak frankly?" She lowered her gaze to meet his, her heart quickening at the intensity she found there. "Of course, Your Grace." "I sense that you harbor doubts about my intentions," he said directly. "That perhaps you suspect some ulterior motive behind my interest in you." Isadora hesitated, torn between honesty and decorum. "You must admit, Your Grace, that your attention is unexpected. I would be naive not to question it." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Then allow me to address those doubts directly. I'm 38 years old, Miss Harrington. I've spent the past 15 years fending off matchmaking mamas and their increasingly desperate attempts to secure my title for their daughters. I've been paraded before every eligible young lady from Land's End to John O'Groats, and I've found them universally tedious, pretty faces concealing empty minds, or worse, calculating ambitions." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "And then, at yet another interminable ball, I encountered a woman who stood apart from the usual preening and posturing. A woman who watched the proceedings with clear-eyed intelligence and a hint of well-earned cynicism. A woman whose conversation, when I finally engineered an opportunity to experience it, revealed depth and substance rather than the usual vapid pleasantries." Isadora felt her cheeks warming under his steady gaze. "You make me sound far more interesting than I am, Your Grace." "On the contrary," he replied, "I suspect I've only begun to discover how interesting you truly are, Miss Harrington, and I find myself eager to continue that discovery, if you will permit it." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a group of fashionable ladies whose exclamations of surprise at encountering the Duke of Blackhurst in such circumstances echoed through the humid air of the Palm House. "Your Grace," called Lady Winfield, a notorious gossip whose daughter had failed to secure the Duke's interest during the previous season. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you at Kew on this fine morning." Her gaze moved to Isadora, and a look of poorly concealed disdain crossed her features. And Miss Harrington as well. How unusual. The Duke's expression cooled perceptibly. Lady Winfield, ladies. Miss Harrington and I were just discussing the remarkable architectural achievements of Decimus Burton. You'll forgive us if we continue our tour. Without waiting for a response, he guided Isadora toward a less crowded section of the glass house, his hand warm and reassuring at the small of her back. "I apologize for the interruption," he murmured. "It appears we cannot escape society's watchful eyes, even here." "This is to be expected," Isadora remarked with her usual pragmatism. "Your every move is always subject to interest, and my presence at your side is particularly notable." "Is it because of your age?" he inquired pointedly. Isadora paused, momentarily taken aback by his directness. "Yes," she admitted after a brief moment. "Among other factors, such as my lack of beauty, fortune, or especially distinguished family connections," she replied with honesty. "The fact that I have been considered firmly on the shelf for at least a decade." The Duke's expression became stern. Society's judgment of worth is exceptionally superficial. Beauty fades, fortunes fluctuate, and distinguished families often yield undistinguished offspring. As for the term "on the shelf," he made no attempt to conceal his disdain for the phrase. "I find that specific social construct to be both arbitrary and idiotic." In spite of herself, Isadora laughed, a spontaneous sound of surprise and joy that resonated pleasantly in the humid air. "Your Grace, I believe you may be the first person I've encountered who views it that way." His expression softened at her laughter. "Then the rest of society is blind. Tell me, Miss Harrington, if you had not been bound by convention, what might you have pursued in life?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure I understand." "If marriage had not been the sole acceptable path for a woman of your standing," he clarified, "what interests might have engaged you?" Isadora pondered the question thoughtfully as they continued their walk among the exotic plants. "I would have liked to travel," she finally said, "to see the art and architecture I've only read about, to experience different cultures and landscapes firsthand." "Where would you go first?" he prompted, genuinely curious. "Italy, I think," she responded, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Florence, Rome, Venice, to see the works of the Renaissance masters in their original settings, and after Italy, perhaps Greece, Egypt. The ancient civilizations have always fascinated me." She paused, looking somewhat embarrassed. "I sound rather like a schoolgirl with fanciful dreams." "Not at all," the Duke countered firmly. "You sound like someone with a mind eager for knowledge and experience, qualities I find infinitely more attractive than the shallow accomplishments society praises in its young ladies." A declaration of intent. They had reached a secluded corner of the glass house, shielded from curious eyes by a stand of bamboo. The Duke turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Harrington, Isadora, if I may. I wish to be completely clear about my intentions. I'm not engaging in a game. I'm not trying to create a scandal. I'm pursuing you because, in the short time of our acquaintance, you have captured my mind and intrigued my heart in ways no other woman has managed in 38 years of existence." He took her gloved hand in his. "I acknowledge that my attention places you in an uncomfortable position. Society will gossip. Your family will worry, and you yourself may doubt the sincerity of my regard. But I ask only that you grant me the opportunity to demonstrate that regard through continued acquaintance." Isadora looked up into his face, the strong aristocratic features that had launched countless matrimonial campaigns, and saw only earnest intent in his grey eyes. "Your Grace, Richard," he gently corrected. "When we are not in formal company, I should like to hear my name on your lips." "Richard," she repeated, the intimate address causing a tremor in her voice. "I fear you may be setting yourself up for disappointment. I'm not young, not beautiful in the conventional sense." "You are beautiful to me," he interrupted, his thumb tracing a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. Your intelligence shines in your eyes. Your dignity lends grace to every movement. Your smile, when you deign to bestow it, transforms your entire countenance." He stepped closer, near enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood clinging to his clothing. "I've observed countless debutantes display their youth and superficial charms before me, Isadora. Not one of them has moved me as you did with a single dance, a single conversation." Isadora felt breathless, caught between decades of ingrained caution and the undeniable pull of the connection forming between them. "Society will be merciless," she softly warned. "Society has always been merciless," he countered. "To you for remaining unmarried, to me for refusing to choose a bride to their liking. Perhaps it is time we both stopped allowing its cruelty to dictate our happiness." The moment hung between them, delicate and charged with possibility. Then, with a gentle squeeze of her hand, Richard stepped back, restoring a proper distance between them. "I've overwhelmed you," he observed, reading her expression with remarkable accuracy. "Forgive me, I did not intend to press my case so forcefully on this occasion." "No," Isadora replied, finding her voice. "That is, I appreciate your candor. It is refreshing after so many years of polite fictions." He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features and sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Then perhaps we might continue this conversation over luncheon. I've taken the liberty of arranging a private meal in the director's residence. He is an old friend and has kindly offered the use of his dining room." The growing connection. The remainder of their visit to the garden passed in a pleasant haze for Isadora. The private luncheon proved delightful, with conversation flowing easily between discussions of art, literature, and philosophy. The Duke, Richard, revealed himself to be widely read and thoughtful, with opinions that challenged rather than merely echoed the prevailing wisdom of their class. As he handed her back into his carriage for the return journey to Harrington House, he asked quietly, "Might I call on you again tomorrow?" "Yes," Isadora replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the readiness of her answer. "I should like that very much." His smile, warm and genuine, stayed with her long after she had returned home to face her family's curious questioning about the outing. That evening, Edward cornered her in the library, his expression troubled. "Isadora, what exactly is transpiring between you and Blackhurst? The entire town is talking." "I'm not entirely certain myself," she admitted, selecting a volume from the shelf to avoid meeting her brother's concerned gaze. "He has expressed interest in a continued acquaintance." "Interest?" Edward repeated skeptically. "Isadora, the man is courting you openly and without apology. It is unprecedented." She finally turned to face him. "Do you find it so impossible to believe that someone might genuinely desire my company, Edward?" Her brother had the good grace to look abashed. "Of course not. You are intelligent, kind, and possessed of more substance than most women half your age. But Blackhurst, his reputation for fastidiousness, for impossible standards, the fact that he has rejected every suitable match for 15 years, only to suddenly show interest in—" He stopped abruptly. "In a spinster of 40, Isadora finished for him, her voice steady despite the sting. "Yes, it is unexpected. I've said as much to him directly." And what was his response? A small smile touched her lips as she recalled Richard's words in the Palm House. He said that society's assessment of worth is remarkably shallow, and that he finds the concept of being on the shelf both arbitrary and idiotic. Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That does not sound like the Blackhurst I have heard described at my club." "Perhaps," Isadora suggested gently, "the Duke the town believes it knows is not the man himself, but rather the title they all covet." Her brother studied her face intently. "You like him?" he observed, sounding faintly astonished. "I find his company stimulating," she acknowledged carefully. "His conversation is intelligent, his opinions thoughtful, and his manner refreshingly direct." Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he had maintained since boyhood. "Isadora, I only wish to protect you from potential hurt. If Blackhurst is sincere, then I could not be more delighted for you. But if this is some passing fancy on his part, then I shall endure it as I have endured everything else," she replied with quiet dignity. "But Edward, what if it is not? What if after all these years I've encountered someone who sees me, truly sees me for who I am? Would you have me reject that possibility out of fear?" Her brother's expression softened. "No," he admitted finally. "No, I would not. But promise me you will proceed with caution. Your heart has been preserved intact for 40 years. I would not see it broken now." "I promise," she assured him, though in truth she feared it might already be too late for caution. The seed of hope that Richard had planted in her heart was already taking root, growing stronger with each encounter, each conversation, each glimpse of the man beneath the ducal title. The open courtship. Over the following weeks, London society watched in fascinated disbelief as the Duke of Blackhurst's courtship of Miss Isadora Harrington continued with unwavering purpose. He called at Harrington House almost daily, sent flowers and books with thoughtful notes, and escorted her to exhibitions, concerts, and even the opera, appearing utterly indifferent to the whispers and stares their appearances together provoked. For Isadora, who had spent decades in the shadows of society, the sudden spotlight was both exhilarating and terrifying. She found herself scrutinized at every turn, her gowns, her hairstyle, her conversation all subject to unprecedented attention and often cruel commentary. "I heard Lady Winfield say it must be some sort of wager," Charlotte confided, as she helped Isadora prepare for an evening at the theatre. "That Hartwell must have challenged Blackhurst to court the most unlikely woman in London." Isadora's hands stilled in the act of fastening her earrings. "And what did you say to that?" "I told her that if the Duke had made such a wager, he would have chosen someone truly objectionable." "Perhaps Lady Winfield herself," Charlotte replied with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Honestly, Isadora, the jealousy is palpable. Half the mothers in London have spent years throwing their daughters at Blackhurst without success, and now he has chosen you. It's driving them to distraction." "Chosen is perhaps too strong a word," Isadora cautioned, though her heart warmed at her sister-in-law's defense. "He enjoys my company, that is all." Charlotte snorted delicately. "A man like the Duke of Blackhurst does not escort a woman to the opera merely because he enjoys her company. He is courting you, Isadora. The only question is when he will make his intentions official." Isadora turned from the mirror, her expression troubled. "Charlotte, do you not find it strange that after all these years of being virtually invisible to society, I should suddenly attract the attention of the most eligible man in England?" Her sister-in-law studied her thoughtfully. "What I find strange is that it took someone of Blackhurst's perception to recognize your worth when it has been evident to your family all along." The simple sincerity of the statement brought unexpected tears to Isadora's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Confronting society's malice. That evening at the Royal Theatre, seated in the Duke's private box, Isadora was acutely aware of the opera glasses directed their way from all quarters of the house. The production was Verdi's La Traviata, but she suspected that for most of the audience the real drama was unfolding in their box, where the Duke of Blackhurst sat in close proximity to a woman 20 years past her debut. "You seem distracted," Richard observed during the interval, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm sorry," she apologized. "It is difficult to focus when one is the subject of such avid observation." His gaze swept the theatre, taking note of the many faces turned in their direction. "Would you prefer to leave and give them even more to gossip about?" she replied with a small smile. "No, I shall endure." Richard's expression darkened. "You should not have to endure an evening at the opera, Isadora. Not because of society's petty malice." She placed a gloved hand briefly on his arm, a gesture of intimacy that would not have gone unnoticed by their observers. "I am not as fragile as I appear, Richard. I've weathered the town's indifference for 20 years. I can certainly weather its attention now." His expression softened as he looked down at her hand on his arm. "Your resilience is yet another quality I admire," he said quietly, though I find myself increasingly incensed by the slights you have endured all these years. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of visitors to their box, Lord and Lady Kavanaugh, whose daughter had been among the most recent debutantes to fail to secure the Duke's interest. "Your Grace," Lord Kavanaugh greeted, bowing stiffly. "Miss Harrington, what a surprise to see you at the opera." "Is it, Lord Kavanaugh?" Richard replied coolly. "Miss Harrington is a great appreciator of music, unlike many who attend merely to be seen." The subtle rebuke was not lost on the Kavanaughs, whose attendance at cultural events was indeed more social than artistic in nature. "Of course," Lady Kavanaugh murmured, her smile not reaching her eyes as she addressed Isadora. "How commendable to maintain such interests at your age, Miss Harrington. Most ladies in your position would have retreated from society long ago." "I have never seen the virtue in retreating, Lady Kavanaugh," Isadora replied evenly. "Life has much to offer at every age, if one remains open to its possibilities." Richard's eyes warmed with approval at her response. "Indeed," he agreed, placing his hand over hers where it still rested on his arm, "a philosophy more should adopt, in my opinion." The gesture, intimate and possessive, caused Lady Kavanaugh's eyes to widen with shock. Lord Kavanaugh, sensing the increasing tension, made their excuses and ushered his wife from the box with barely concealed haste. The threshold of Blackhurst Manor. As the second act began, Richard leaned close to whisper in Isadora's ear, "You handled that beautifully. Most would have withered under Lady Kavanaugh's barbs." "Years of practice," she replied softly, though in truth the barbs had seemed far less painful with him beside her, his steady presence a shield against society's cruelty. Later that evening, as Richard escorted her to her door after the performance, he paused on the steps of Harrington House, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Isadora, I wonder if you might consider accompanying me to Blackhurst Manor this weekend," he said. "I host a small house party each spring for a select circle of friends and family. I should very much like you to attend." She stared at him in surprise. A private call was one thing, flowers and books mere tokens. Even public appearances at cultural events could be dismissed as the eccentricity of a duke known for his unconventional tastes. But an invitation to his ancestral home to meet his family and closest friends, that was a declaration of serious intent that could not be misconstrued. "Richard, are you certain?" she asked, searching his face in the soft glow of the carriage lamps. "Such an invitation will be seen as precisely what it is," he interrupted gently. "A clear statement of my regard and intentions. I am weary of the speculation, Isadora. I wish to make my feelings plain not only to you, but to all of society." Her heart thundered in her chest. And what are those feelings? In answer, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. "I believe you know," he said softly. "But if you require the words, I shall speak them here and now, regardless of who might witness." Isadora shook her head quickly, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "No, not here, not like this." His expression gentled with understanding. "Then say you will come to Blackhurst. Allow me to introduce you to those dearest to me. Let me show you the place that has shaped me for better or worse." The invitation represented a threshold, Isadora knew, a point of no return. If she accepted, she would be publicly acknowledging the seriousness of their connection, inviting both increased scrutiny and inevitable disappointment if the relationship failed to culminate in marriage. Yet looking into Richard's steady grey eyes, she found she could not refuse. Whatever happened, whatever pain might lie ahead, she would not deny herself this chance at a happiness she had long since ceased to believe possible. "Yes," she said finally, "I will come to Blackhurst." His smile, rare and transformative, illuminated his features. "You have made me very happy, Isadora," he said simply. Then, with a formal bow that belied the intimacy of the moment they had just shared, He bid her good night and returned to his waiting carriage. Family support and arrival. Inside Harrington House, Isadora found Edward waiting in the entrance hall, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Well," he prompted when she had handed her wrap to the waiting footman. "What did Blackhurst have to say for himself tonight?" "He has invited me to Blackhurst Manor for his spring house party," she replied, still somewhat dazed by the invitation and its implications. Edward's eyebrows shot up. "Good Lord, and you accepted?" "I did." Her brother studied her face intently. "Then it appears his intentions are serious indeed." "So it would seem," she agreed softly. Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and took her hands in his. "Isadora, if this is what you want, if Blackhurst is what you want, then you have my full support. Whatever whispers or obstacles society may throw in your path, know that your family stands with you." Tears pricked at Isadora's eyes at this unexpected declaration. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered, squeezing his hands gratefully. Her brother cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Yes. Well, it's about time someone recognized your worth, even if it had to be the most intimidating man in England." The weekend of the Blackhurst house party arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though spring itself had conspired to make the occasion perfect. Isadora travelled to Kent in Richard's personal carriage, accompanied by Charlotte, as propriety demanded, though Edward would join them the following day. As the carriage crested a hill, Blackhurst Manor came into view. A magnificent Palladian mansion set amid rolling parkland, its limestone facade gleaming golden in the afternoon sun. "Heavens!" Charlotte breathed, leaning forward for a better view. "It's even grander than they say." Isadora could only nod, momentarily overwhelmed by the reality of what she was doing, approaching the ancestral seat of one of England's oldest dukedoms as a potential duchess rather than a mere visitor. The very thought seemed absurd, yet here she was, responding to an invitation that could have only one meaning. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing entrance, Richard himself emerged to greet them, descending the wide stone steps with an eager stride that belied his usual reserve. "Isadora," he said warmly, helping her from the carriage with gentle hands. "Welcome to Blackhurst." For a moment they stood gazing at each other, oblivious to the servants arrayed on the steps or Charlotte being handed down behind them. Then, recollecting himself, Richard turned to greet Charlotte with correct, if cooler, courtesy, before escorting them both into the entrance hall. The interior of Blackhurst Manor was every bit as impressive as its exterior. Soaring ceilings, marble floors, and walls hung with ancestral portraits and priceless works of art. Despite its grandeur, Isadora found an unexpected warmth to the Duke's residence, perceiving it as a genuine home rather than merely a showcase of aristocratic affluence. Richard informed them that rooms had been prepared in the East Wing. "The outlook onto the Rose Garden is particularly lovely this time of year. I believed you would appreciate it," he told Isadora. This personal consideration deeply touched her, and she responded, "Thank you, Richard. That was exceptionally thoughtful." Her use of his first name, still a novelty, seemed to please him immensely, and his expression softened. Richard then mentioned he would allow them to rest and refresh themselves before dinner, noting that the other guests would be arriving throughout the afternoon. As a maid guided them to their quarters, Charlotte leaned in to whisper, "Did you notice how he looked at you, Isadora? If that man is not in love, I will consume my finest hat." Isadora quietly shushed her friend, though the observation made her heart sore. Could it possibly be true? Could Richard, the Duke of Blackhurst, genuinely harbor feelings for her? The prospect seemed too extraordinary to believe, yet the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Preparing for the evening and meeting the inner circle. After a brief rest, Isadora began her preparations for dinner with Charlotte's assistance, choosing a gown of deep amethyst silk that complemented her hair and imparted a glow to her face. "You look delightful," Charlotte declared after fastening the final button. Truly, Isadora, I have never seen you appear more stunning. Examining her reflection, Isadora had to agree there was a noticeable change in her appearance, not in her features, which remained the same, but in her expression and demeanor. A light was present in her eyes that had been absent for years, a confidence in her posture that signaled renewed hope. As they proceeded to the drawing room, where pre-dinner beverages were being served, Isadora was keenly aware of the scrutiny she was about to face from Richard's closest associates. These were not the general society whose opinions she had learned to disregard, but people whose judgment mattered to the man who, against all odds, had come to matter profoundly to her. Richard immediately approached to greet them, looking resplendent in evening attire that accentuated his impressive height and athletic physique. "Isadora, Charlotte," he said warmly, "permit me to introduce you to my guests." The group in the drawing room was smaller and less daunting than Isadora had feared. Just 8 individuals, including Richard's oldest friend from Cambridge, Lord James Hartwell, his younger sister, Lady Eleanor Vallemont, a striking woman in her early 30s, his cousin, Lord Henry Vallemont, and his wife, and 2 other couples who appeared to be long-standing family acquaintances. A cordial reception and flattering confidences. To Isadora's surprise and great relief, the reception she received was uniformly cordial, with Richard's sister, in particular, going out of her way to ensure she felt welcome. "My brother has mentioned little else but you for weeks," Lady Eleanor confided as they sat together before dinner. Isadora chuckled softly. "I was beginning to think I must be some sort of paragon." Lady Eleanor, studying her with the same shrewd blue eyes as Richard, replied, "I assure you, I am nothing of the sort. Your brother's high regard is flattering, but perhaps overstated." "I think not," she finally said. "Richard does not exaggerate, nor does he act on whim or emotion. If he has singled you out, Miss Harrington, it is because he recognizes genuinely exceptional qualities in you." Before Isadora could respond to this remarkable assertion, dinner was announced, and Richard was at her side to escort her into the dining room. "My sister hasn't overwhelmed you, I trust," he murmured as they walked down the corridor. "Eleanor can be rather direct." "Not at all," Isadora assured him. "It's quite refreshing, in fact. Directness appears to be a family trait." He smiled down at her, his eyes warm, noting it was a characteristic she shared, based on their earlier conversations. The dinner and Richard's revelation. The dinner that followed was unlike any social experience Isadora had ever known. Seated at Richard's right hand, the position of honor typically reserved for the highest-ranking lady present, she found herself at the center of genuine, interested conversation instead of polite dismissal. Richard's friends and family engaged her on subjects ranging from literature to politics, listening to her views with true attention rather than mere courtesy. Most surprising of all was the way Richard himself deferred to her opinions, drawing her into discussions and valuing her contributions in a manner she had never experienced in wider society. "You see," he said softly during a moment when the others were conversing among themselves, "this is why I wanted you to come to Blackhurst, so that you might perceive yourself as I see you, not as London society has labelled you, but as the remarkable woman you genuinely are." The simple sincerity of his words brought a blush to Isadora's cheeks. "You are very kind, Richard." "Not kind," he gently corrected. "Observant, and increasingly certain that I have made the right choice." An evening of acceptance and a tender farewell. After dinner, the party retired to the music room, where Lady Eleanor was persuaded to play the pianoforte. As the evening continued, Isadora discovered herself drawn into the warm circle of Richard's closest acquaintances, accepted not as an oddity or an object of curiosity, but as someone of true interest and worth. It was a revelation. This glimpse of what life could be, freed from the constraints and judgments that had defined her existence for so long. Here, in the intimate setting of Blackhurst Manor, she was not the spinster or poor Miss Harrington, but simply Isadora, valued for her thoughts, her conversation, and herself. As the evening concluded, Richard escorted her to the foot of the grand staircase, lingering behind the others as they headed to their rooms. "You appeared to enjoy yourself," he observed, his voice low and intimate in the quiet of the great hall. "Very much," she admitted. "Your friends and family are most welcoming." "They see what I see," he simply replied. Then, ensuring they were momentarily unobserved, he took her hand, raising it not to his lips as decorum dictated, but pressing it gently against his heart. "Sleep well, Isadora. Tomorrow I would like to show you the grounds, if the weather permits." The gesture, subtle yet weighty with tenderness, left her temporarily speechless. "I should like that," she finally managed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "Good night, Richard." As she ascended the staircase, she could feel his gaze following her, warm and steady like a physical touch. In her room, while preparing for bed, she found herself humming softly, an unconscious expression of a happiness so unexpected and complete that it seemed almost too fragile to acknowledge directly. A walk on the grounds and a deep connection. The following day dawned clear and mild, perfectly suited for the promised tour of the estate. After breakfast, Richard appeared at Isadora's side, offering his arm. "Shall we explore?" he suggested, his eagerness barely concealed beneath his usual composure. They began their walk across the immaculate lawns, Richard pointing out features of the landscape with clear pride and knowledge. It quickly became apparent to Isadora that Blackhurst was not merely a symbol of his rank and wealth, but a living entity to which he was deeply connected. "My father primarily viewed the estate as a source of revenue," he explained as they paused at the edge of a small lake, watching swans glide across the still water. "But for me, it has always been more. These lands, these people, they are a responsibility, yes, but also a privilege to be part of something that stretches back centuries and will continue long after I am gone." "You speak of it with such passion," Isadora observed, watching his face as he looked across his domain. "It's clear how much Blackhurst means to you." His expression softened as he turned to look at her. "It is my home, Isadora. The one place where I have always felt truly myself, unconstrained by the expectations and formalities of society." He paused, something vulnerable entering his gaze. "I wanted you to see it, to understand this part of me." The simple honesty of his statement touched her deeply. "Thank you for sharing it with me," she said softly. "It helps me see you more clearly, not just the Duke that London knows, but the man behind the title." "That," he replied, his voice low and fervent, "is precisely what I hoped for. So few people look beyond the dukedom to see the man. You have done so from the beginning, Isadora. It is one of the many reasons I find myself increasingly drawn to you." Richard's proposal. They continued their walk, crossing a stone bridge that gracefully arched over a narrow section of the lake. In the distance, Isadora could see other guests enjoying the fine spring weather. "Richard," she began carefully, "I must ask you something that has been troubling me." He glanced down at her, his expression open. "Anything. Are you certain about this?" She vaguely gestured between them. "Society has expectations for a man in your position. A duke typically marries a young woman of impeccable lineage, someone who can provide heirs and manage a great household. I am 40 years old, Richard. The likelihood of my bearing children is reduced but not impossible," he completed for her, his tone matter-of-fact, "and while an heir is certainly desirable, it is not my primary consideration in choosing a wife." He led her to a stone bench overlooking the lake and its surrounding gardens, taking her hands in his as they sat. "Isadora, I have spent 15 years watching young women of impeccable lineage parade before me, each more vacuous and calculating than the last." He confessed to enduring countless dinner conversations so tedious they made him question whether the continuation of his line was worth the lifetime of boredom it would entail. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Isadora found herself smiling at his blunt assessment. Surely they could not all have been so dreadful. Perhaps not, he conceded, but none, not one, ever looked at me as you do, as though I am a person worthy of genuine interest rather than merely a title to be acquired. His thumbs traced gentle patterns on the backs of her hands, sending shivers up her arms despite the warmth of the day. As for managing a great household, Blackhurst has run efficiently for centuries under the guidance of capable stewards. What I seek in a wife is not an administrator, but a companion. Someone whose conversation I enjoy, whose opinions I respect, whose presence brings me peace rather than obligation. Isadora's heart quickened at the implication of his words. Yet she still hesitated. "Richard, you must know how people will talk. The tongue will be merciless." "Let them talk," he replied with quiet intensity. "I have never governed my life according to society's expectations, Isadora. I see no reason to start now, particularly when doing so would deny me the chance at genuine happiness." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that caused her breath to catch in her throat. "I'd planned to wait until this evening after the others had retired," he said, his voice betraying a rare nervousness. "But perhaps here, in this place that has witnessed the sweep of centuries, is more fitting." Opening the box, he revealed a magnificent emerald ring surrounded by diamonds, its antique setting speaking of history and permanence. "This belonged to my grandmother, the 5th Duchess," he explained, his eyes never leaving Isadora's face. "A woman of remarkable intelligence and character, who defied convention in her own time. I believe she would approve of my choice." With deliberate care, he slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her gaze. "Isadora Harrington, you have brought light into my life, where before there was only duty. You have shown me that true connection is possible, even for someone as guarded as myself. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The acceptance and the kiss. Isadora stared at him, scarcely able to believe the moment was real. Here was Richard Vallemont, Duke of Blackhurst, the most eligible bachelor in England, on his knee before her, offering not just his name and position, but his heart. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "are you absolutely certain? The world will not understand." "I am not asking the world to marry me," he replied simply. "I am asking you." In that moment, looking into his steady grey eyes, Isadora felt the last of her doubts dissolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever whispers might follow them, the chance to share her life with this remarkable man was worth any price. "Yes," she said softly. Then, with growing certainty, "Yes, Richard, I will marry you." His expression transformed with a joy so naked and unguarded that it stole her breath. Rising, he took the ring from its velvet nest and slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, as though it had been made for her hand. "My Duchess," he murmured, raising her fingers to his lips. Then, ensuring they were unobserved, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her lips. There first, a seal on the promise they had just exchanged. When they finally parted, Isadora felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. Everything before this moment had been merely a prelude to the life now opening before her. At 40 years old, when society had long since relegated her to the margins, she had found love with a man who saw her true worth. Sharing the news and societal reaction. "Shall we share our news with the others?" Richard asked, his eyes still bright with happiness. "Yes," she agreed, her heart full to overflowing, "though I imagine your sister at least may have anticipated this development." He laughed, a free, joyful sound she had rarely heard from him. "Elelanena has been hinting rather heavily that I should secure my happiness before you could change your mind about me." "Change my mind?" Isadora echoed incredulously, as if that were possible. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, where their news would be met first with delight from those closest to them and later with shock and scandal by society at large. But in that moment, with Richard's strong fingers intertwined with hers, and the emerald gleaming on her hand, Isadora found she cared not at all for what the world might think. She had spent 40 years living according to society's expectations and limitations. Now she would forge a new path, as the Duchess of Blackhurst. Yes, but more importantly, as a woman who had found love when she least expected it, with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. The news of their engagement spread through London society like wildfire, igniting a conflagration of gossip, speculation, and barely veiled disbelief. Drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs buzzed with discussion of the unprecedented match, the most eligible duke in England choosing as his bride a woman of 40, neither beautiful nor wealthy, who had long since been consigned to spinsterhood. It must be some sort of bizarre infatuation, Lady Winfield declared to her circle of confidants over tea. Men of a certain age sometimes develop these peculiar fixations. It will pass, of course, but unfortunately not before he has bound himself to her permanently. Perhaps she has bewitched him somehow, suggested another matron, whose own daughter had failed to capture the Duke's interest the previous season. They even whispered that her mother's family had connections to those mystical Romani travelers. Such whispers reached Isadora's ears, of course. Servants talked, and Charlotte made it her business to report the most outrageous speculations with a mixture of indignation and dark humor. Yet, to her own surprise, Isadora found the gossip affected her far less than it might have before. "Let them talk," she said to Charlotte, unconsciously echoing Richard's words. "In time, they will find some new scandal to occupy them." The wedding and the start of a new life. The engagement was brief by society's standards, just 6 weeks, during which Isadora suddenly found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. There were trousseau fittings, meetings with solicitors regarding settlements, consultations about the refurbishment of the Duchess's apartments at Blackhurst, and countless other details that demanded attention. Throughout it all, Richard remained a steady presence, attentive, supportive, and increasingly demonstrative of his affection, particularly when they managed to steal moments alone. Isadora discovered in herself a capacity for happiness she had thought long extinguished, a youthful joy that belied her 40 years. "You look younger every day," Edward remarked one evening as they sat together in the library at Harrington House. "I would never have believed it possible, but impending marriage appears to agree with you, sister." Isadora smiled, touching the emerald ring that now adorned her finger. "Happiness agrees with me, Edward. Something I had nearly forgotten was possible." Her brother's expression softened. "You deserve it, Isadora. No one deserves it more." The wedding itself was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, a concession to Richard's position rather than Isadora's preference for a quieter ceremony. The church was filled to capacity, though Isadora knew many had come not to celebrate their union, but to witness what society considered a peculiar spectacle. Yet, as she walked down the aisle on Edward's arm, her gaze fixed on Richard waiting at the altar, she found she cared not at all for the whispers that followed her progress. What mattered was the man before her, tall and commanding in his formal attire, his usually austere features transformed by an expression of such naked adoration that it caused murmurs to ripple through the congregation. Their vows were exchanged with clear, steady voices, a promise not just of fidelity and support, but of a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Richard slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger to join the emerald engagement ring, his hands were gentle, his touch lingering longer than strictly necessary. "I now pronounce you man and wife," declared the bishop. And with those words, Isadora Harrington became her grace, the Duchess of Blackhurst, a transformation so complete yet so unexpected that she felt momentarily dizzy with the reality of it. The reception that followed at Blackhurst House, the Duke's London residence, was a study in contrasts. genuine warmth from Richard's inner circle mingling with barely concealed curiosity and skepticism from the broader society who had felt obligated to attend. Yet Isadora found herself floating through the afternoon with a serene confidence, Richard's steady presence at her side a shield against any potential barbs. "How are you faring, Duchess?" he murmured during a brief moment alone, the new title sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Remarkably well," she replied honestly, "though I suspect many of our guests are still waiting for you to reveal this has all been an elaborate jest." Richard's eyes darkened. "They will wait a very long time then," he said firmly, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "You are mine now, Isadora, as I am yours. The rest of the world can go hang." Later that evening, as their carriage carried them away from the reception toward the beginning of their wedding journey, a tour of Italy that Richard had insisted on arranging, knowing it had been Isadora's lifelong dream to see the art and architecture she had only read about, Isadora found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. "Are you well?" Richard asked, noting her silence as they left London behind. "Beyond satisfactory," she reassured him, her hand seeking his within the unlit carriage. "I was simply contemplating the remarkable nature of existence." Just 6 months prior, I had accepted a destiny of peaceful singledom, observing the vibrancy of other people's lives from the periphery. "And now, tell me now," he encouraged gently. "At this moment, I am beginning a completely fresh phase with a gentleman I've grown to cherish far beyond any expectation." This confession, marking the initial instance she voiced the sentiment love, flowed effortlessly. Richard gasped noticeably. Subsequently, in a rapid and resolute gesture, he drew her close, their mouths meeting in an embrace considerably more fervent than the restrained one exchanged during their marriage ceremony. Once their separation occurred, leaving both momentarily gasping, his brow gently touched hers. "My feelings for you, Isadora, began with our very first waltz," he admitted, his tone gravelly with deep feeling. "Even though I barely understood the sensation back then, it has been years since I permitted myself to desire anything outside the bounds of obligation and burden." Isadora lifted her hand to cradle his face, relishing the liberty to make contact, to display the affection that had developed between the pair. "Yet now, this very moment," he stated, pulling her even nearer, "I realize I wish for a complete life shared with you. This includes a shared existence, a family, should destiny allow, and a true collaboration in all aspects." "Even if the social world never truly welcomes us?" she inquired, voicing the single remaining reservation. Richard offered a quiet, carefree laugh. "The establishment will adapt, as it invariably does. Eventually, our union will simply be one more entry in the records of the town's history. However, the connection we forge, my Adora, will be our enduring inheritance, profoundly surpassing any trivial rumor or controversy." While the carriage proceeded through the twilight landscape towards Dover, where a vessel was ready to transport them to the continent and the start of their joint explorations, Isadora leaned her head on her spouse's shoulder, contemplating the path that had led her to this point. Even at the age of 40, when conventional society had decided she was beyond the age for affection or fresh starts, she had discovered not merely love, but a companion who treasured her precisely for herself, esteemed for her maturity and background, which had cultivated her judgment and integrity. Conversely, Richard, who had maintained an emotional distance from the world for a long time, discovered in her a mate whose company enhanced, rather than detracted from, his life, whose affection had revived aspects of his personality he believed permanently suppressed. Jointly, they would confront all forthcoming obstacles, the likely doubts from the elite, the practical details of their coming years, and the necessary compromises involved in constructing a mutual life following long periods of self-reliance. Nevertheless, their approach would be as equals, united by more than the mere legal contract of marriage, cemented by an authentic and profound bond that had overturned every prediction. "I adore you, Richard," Isadora murmured into the soothing stillness that had settled between them. His embrace around her shoulders grew firm, his mouth lightly touching her temple in a display of fondness that required no verbal expression. Still, he chose to speak, his profound voice hushed within the carriage's private darkness. "And I cherish you, my Duchess, beyond anything I had ever conceived." The magnificent hall at Blackhurst Manor shimmered under the glow of countless candles. The atmosphere scented delicately with hothouse blossoms, while the most distinguished members of society socialized and danced beneath the vaulted ceilings. Positioned centrally were the Duke and Duchess of Blackhurst themselves, their demeanors composed as they welcomed attendees with elegant amiability. "They present a remarkable pair, don't you think?" Lady Elena remarked softly to Edward, who had just requested her presence for the next dance. "It is difficult to believe the controversy their marriage once generated." Edward watched his sibling, offering a smile as she stood next to her spouse, her reddish-brown hair now generously marked with white streaks, styled beautifully and accented by the Blackhurst emeralds. Being 42 years old, Isadora exuded an inner certainty and happiness that rendered her more lovely than she had appeared even in her younger years. "High society tends to forget quickly when faced with undeniable achievement," he commented, guiding Lady Elena to join the dance formation. "And by any standard, their union has proven to be an exceptional triumph." Truly, the elite who had initially spoken so harshly regarding the Duke's baffling selection had progressively quieted over the ensuing months as Richard's commitment to his more mature wife remained steadfast. In fact, his affection for Isadora had only intensified over time, a fact apparent in how his gaze instinctively found her in bustling gatherings, in the careful attention he gave her words, and in the unspoken exchanges that suggested a bond much more profound than simple social arrangement. From the other side of the ballroom, a youthful attendant came to the Duchess, leaning in to convey a private message. Isadora's expression instantly brightened with happiness, and she quickly reached out to touch her husband's arm, sharing information that altered his typically controlled demeanor into one of pure joy. Following quick excuses to their attendees, the Duke and Duchess subtly exited the ballroom, allowing their company to wander about their swift retreat. "The children's quarters, I suspect," Lady Elena clarified to Edward as their dance concluded. "My nephew possesses a distinct gift for ensuring his needs arise precisely during required social engagements." Edward let out a soft laugh, remarking, "That's a characteristic he appears to have acquired from his father, judging by Richard's well-timed escapes from tiresome discussions in Parliament." The unforeseen blessing of Isadora, conceiving mere months following their nuptials, had effectively quieted the final doubters in high society. The arrival of James Edward Richard Valmont, the Marquis of Westland and future Duke of Blackhurst, 10 months after their wedding, had converted the perceived scandal into a storybook romance in the view of the ton. Up in the expansive nursery apartment, which looked out over the gardens bathed in moonlight, Isadora and Richard were together at the bassinet of their son, who was 8 months old, observing the nanny soothe him back to slumber following his nightly nourishment. "He shares your eyes," Richard commented gently, his arm encircling his wife's middle. "And your tenacity," Isadora countered with a light-hearted laugh, insisting on attention during the height of our spring celebration. Richard placed a gentle kiss on her temple, breathing in the comforting fragrance of lavender from her hair. "I can scarcely fault him. I also find your presence more appealing than the totality of our assembled company." The nurse performed a respectful bow and departed, leaving the couple alone with their resting child. The infant the social world had judged an impossibility, yet who was here, nevertheless, robust and deeply loved by both his mother and father. "Occasionally, I still struggle to comprehend that this is truly my existence," Isadora confided, leaning into her husband's hold. "That every part of this, you, James Blackhurst, is tangible, not a lovely illusion from which I will awaken. It is profoundly real, Richard confirmed, turning her delicately to face him within his arms. Although I admit to experiencing comparable instants of doubt, how did I manage to live for 38 years before you, Isadora? That thought is now incomprehensible. She raised her hand to feel his face, outlining the cherished contours that had grown as intimately known to her as her own reflection. I believe we were united precisely when we were prepared, when both of us had enough life experience to genuinely appreciate worth upon encountering it. Richard offered a smile, the sincere, heartfelt expression he reserved solely for her and their child. The single greatest finding of my lifetime, he assented, leaning in to meet her lips in a soft kiss. Beneath them, the strains of music from the main hall floated upward through the opened panes, a subtle notification of the required social duties demanding their presence. Still, they paused for another moment, enveloped in one another's embrace beside their slumbering baby, cherishing the valuable actuality of the family unit they had established. "We ought to rejoin our visitors," Isadora eventually whispered, despite making no attempt to break free from his hold. "In just a moment," Richard responded, his gaze still absorbing the view of her, his spouse, his duchess, the lady who had completely changed his existence through her intellect, her grace, and her immense ability to love. Allow them to wait a brief while longer. And so they stayed, the Duke and his improbable Duchess, their remarkable romance having quieted the rumors and challenged the established norms of their society. Working as one, they had redefined the limits of what was attainable, demonstrating that authentic attachment could thrive regardless of age. That true worth resided not in appearance or youthful vigor, but in the profound nature and excellence of one's disposition, And that affection, when sincere, was capable of conquering even the most rigid social constraints. In the crib next to them, the young James briefly shifted, his tiny hand extending while he slept. Isadora delicately adjusted the covering around him, her heart overflowing with such profound devotion for her family that it felt too vast to be contained. "Are you happy?" Richard inquired tenderly, observing her face illuminated by the soft light of the lamp. "Beyond any possibility I ever conceived," she answered with candid sincerity. Joining hands, they quietly departed the nursery and descended toward the brightly lit ballroom beneath, where high society anticipated the reappearance of the Duke and Duchess, whose improbable romance was now celebrated across London. It was no longer a controversy, but a source of motivation. By finding one another, Isadora and Richard had uncovered not merely individual contentment, but a reality too powerful to ignore. That affection, authentic and deep, acknowledges no limitations of age or custom, and that it is genuinely never, at any time, too late to start anew. Esteemed audience member, existence, much like the narrative of Isadora and Richard, seldom proceeds along the trajectory we anticipate. In an era that frequently prioritizes youthfulness over everything else, it is easy to assume that opportunities for affection, for fresh starts, or for delight decrease with the passage of time. However, Isadora's experience offers a reminder of a deep, fundamental truth. It is never too late to attain happiness. When she reached 40, the social circle had already determined her life's narrative, a chronicle of remaining single and accepting a muted fate. Yet her most remarkable period was only just unfolding. This blossoming occurred not despite her maturity, but as a direct result of it. The insight she had acquired, the understanding of self she had nurtured, and the self-respect she preserved through years of implied rejection. These specific attributes were exactly what rendered her truly extraordinary to a person capable of seeing past the restrictive social criteria for value. Perhaps you too have occasionally experienced a sense of being unnoticed. Perhaps you have heard suggestions that your chance has gone by, that prospects for romance, excitement, or satisfaction are reserved for those of a younger age. But hold this thought, the most genuine bonds frequently emerge after we have matured sufficiently to possess true self-awareness. This happens once we have endured setbacks and emerged with our compassionate nature undamaged. Your accumulated life history is not a disadvantage. Instead, it is your greatest asset. The forbearance you have cultivated, the insight you have acquired, and the fortitude you have established are riches that cannot be measured. Just as Richard did, the appropriate people will acknowledge and greatly value these characteristics in you. This evening, while you ready yourself for rest, understand that your personal narrative is still progressing in lovely and surprising directions. Sleep peacefully, with the knowledge that the most significant segments of your life story could yet be in the future. You are noticed, you are appreciated, and you deserve complete joy, regardless of your age. We extend our most sincere gratitude for joining us on this voyage. Our profound thanks for remaining with us throughout the entire telling. We trust that the narrative of Isadora and Richard offered a powerful recall that affection is ageless, and that being acknowledged for your genuine self represents the highest form of romance. If this account resonated deeply within you, kindly consider subscribing, hitting the like button, leaving a comment, and sharing it with those you hold dear. Your encouragement inspires us to continue sharing further tales, rich with passion, recovery, and unexpected emotional turns. Following this segment, you will find a recommendation for another compelling narrative from our offerings. Please select it and allow yourself to be immersed in even more memorable feelings with great affection.